So this morning, as you do, I looked to the website. Rich got his PhD from Bristol in 2010, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
12, to me, that doesn't sound very long. 12
Fair enough,
years
fair enough.
doesn't sound very long at all, because you're now a senior lecturer, so that's pretty good going. Postdoc at the University of Cape Town, then worked for Bristol Zoological Society and came to us as a Pew Fellow in 2019. A year later was a lecturer, and a year after that a senior lecturer. So lots has been happening.
It feels like longer than that, but
Yeah, that's what it says on the website.
well, probably.
And just recently, Rich joined the ESI again as a proper core member of the academic team. We're really pleased about this. It links us up with everything he's doing, but also Exeter Marine, which is a growing area of research on campus. So great to have you with us. He's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions and discussion. So looking forward to it.
So yeah,
Oh, I should have said the title: Monitoring and Mitigating Marine Megafaunal Declines in the Anthropocene.
yeah, really optimistic title. Why do I always do that? Yeah, thanks, Jane. Thanks for that introduction. It is really nice to be doing this talk. It's really nice to come back to the ESI after a short sojourn in the farmhouse, and that's not a reflection on the standards of the farmhouse. It's just nice to be back here, which was sort of my spiritual home of the university, I suppose. Right, so yeah, very fancy title. I'll try and live up to it, do it some justice. Okay, so what I want to start the story with is, I think we probably can all agree that we're in the grips of some sort of biodiversity crisis. The big sort of drivers of climate change, overfishing, and increasingly various kinds of pollution seem to be having a big impact on biodiversity in the oceans. And although we've only been kind of, our footprint on the oceans doesn't extend quite as far back as our footprint on the land, we seem to be rapidly altering these ecosystems. And certainly, if we look in the so-called high impact journals, we can see lots of examples of papers talking about global marine defaunation, biodiversity and ecosystem loss. This is that famous No Fish by 2048 paper, some of you might have heard of. And then we're also seeing lots of examples of collapsing fisheries. But on the other hand, there's also loads of folks writing in these so-called high impact journals saying that actually maybe it's not so bad as we say it is, that maybe the problem is over exaggerated, and that where we have good management and conservation interventions, we're making a difference and we're kind of bending the curve. This is a paper from Ray Hilborn's group in PNAS, which suggests that for fisheries where we have good fisheries management in place, we're actually starting to see recoveries to biomass at maximum sustainable yield, and in many cases above levels of biomass at maximum sustainable yield. And we can argue about whether maximum sustainable yield is a good thing or not, but essentially for fisheries where we have management, we are bending the curve to some extent and getting recoveries, starting to see recoveries. Folks also argue, and some of you might have seen the recent high profile arguments about the Living Planet Index, possibly not, because I probably pay too much attention to arguments about the Living Planet Index. But certainly we're seeing some high profile papers coming out now saying that actually the stories of kind of wholesale declines that have been reported are maybe not an entire story. It's a bit more nuanced. And actually this top paper here in Nature Communications, for example, suggests that actually if you take a look at, well, not quite all of the vertebrates, but many of the vertebrates as they could get population trends for, that both rare and common species, there's a wide span of population trends, and nearly as many species are increasing as are decreasing. And this argument about the Living Planet Index suggests that actually, again, when you take out some of the really extreme declines, there's a wide spread of population trends. So it's maybe not as clear cut as we think it is to determine like actually what's going on with populations when you look at these sort of global scales. And we're also, of course, dealing with shifting baselines all the time, so we don't often even know really what or where we're indexing from, which kind of makes life kind of complicated. But I think we probably can all agree that extinction risk is increasing, and there's quite a bit of work that suggests that extinction risk is at least as likely in the marine systems, which is blue in this case, as it is in terrestrial systems, again in these high impact journals. And I think we can agree that at least resilience in ecosystems is declining. But I think key thing is it isn't the same for all species, right? So here's another of these high profile papers. This is a meta-analysis of seabird breeding success in response to climate change drivers. Two main take homes from this is there's different responses in the northern and southern hemisphere. And also the key thing is that all of these dotted lines that underlie these kind of main effect lines are actually the individual species that went into that meta-analysis. And there's at least as many species strongly declining. Well, maybe not at least as many, but there's lots of species strongly declining and lots of species showing strong increases in breeding success with climate change. So yes, there's a biodiversity crisis. Yes, species are under pressure from anthropogenic change, but there's lots of nuance. And we really need to know which species to prioritise and which threats to prioritise against, and which management interventions we have in our toolkit will best help us to address the declines for species that are declining. And that is where my kind of overly ambitious title comes from. And the main things we've been working on in our research group in that kind of context are these kind of three key questions. We're kind of trying to understand key drivers of population change. So which bits of the demographic process for some of these long-lived marine vertebrates respond to and which anthropogenic pressures. We're quite interested in understanding how animals use their habitats, how they use the space in their environment, and how that links to population change. So trying to understand that link between movement and demography. And then we're interested in trying to understand what strategies will best stimulate recovery of marine vertebrates. And all of this is kind of underpinned by trying to deal with and understand that uncertainty in marine conservation and in understanding population trajectories. And so I want to tell you about three kind of broad case studies, three kind of areas of work today. I realized that they're all actually, when I was making these slides, they're all fisheries facing, which is maybe a bit of an oversight, but there we are. It's what we have. We've got what we have. The first of those is talking about overfishing and of oceanic sharks and rays. So this is about direct mortality from fisheries. The second one, I'll through an amazing segue take you from oceanic sharks to penguins, foraging in coastal environments, and talk about small-scale marine protected areas and efforts we've been doing to try to understand if we can actually protect pelagic predators by protecting access to pelagic prey with small-scale marine protected areas. And then lastly, if I haven't run out of time by then, I'll talk about the impacts of discards and bycatch on seabirds, which is kind of the third. So discards, bycatch, coming together is the third big impact that fisheries are having. Okay, so first case study is about oceanic sharks and rays. Those of you in the room that know me well will know that I always wanted to be a shark biologist and finally got the chance to do some work on sharks a few years ago. And this kind of focused on, well, actually, I just did work on numbers, but I can pretend it's on sharks. This work I've focused on this problem, which is that sharks have a tendency to get themselves hooked on long lines in the open ocean. Often these are long lines that are actually targeting billfish and tuna, so they're not generally targeting sharks, but sometimes they are the target of these fisheries as well. And I got a chance to do this through working firstly with Henning, who's this smart-looking chap with his University of Cape Town robes on here. When we were in South Africa, we started working on this decision support tool called JARA, which is just another red list assessment, which is uses Bayesian state-space models to fit to population trajectories and help make decisions about how those population trajectories map to IUCN red list categories and criteria. And Henning got me connected up with the shark specialist group of the IUCN, so with Nathan Pacro, Cassie Rigby and Nick Dolby particularly. And while working with them, we were able to do some assessments for some of the oceanic sharks. And that's what's shown on the slides here. This is an example of JARA in work for blue sharks. And what we had for blue sharks is a data-rich species. We have stock assessment data from all of the ocean basins that the blue shark occurs in. And what JARA does is it takes these abundance time series and fits the population trajectories with all of the uncertainty, and then essentially measures the rate of change over 3 generation lengths, which is the time frame the IUCN uses. And that's what's shown by the dotted lines here. So these are being measured over 3 generations. And you can take that as a distribution. So because there's uncertainty in these population trajectories, you can take these distributions of change and overlay them directly on the thresholds for different IUCN categories, which is what's being shown here. And rather than just say to decision makers, this species has declined by 10% or 30%, you can say that the evidence suggests, or the probability is that this species is in the endangered category with 60% probability, for example. And so, for example, the North Atlantic stock falls, but the median and most of the distribution fall into the endangered category. And because these are posterior distributions of Bayesian models, you can easily smoosh them, and haven't come up with a better word, smoosh them together into a global population distribution and make some probability statements about the global status of these animals. And if you're interested in doing that, we've applied it now to a bunch of terrestrial and marine mammals, I think 6 or 7 seabirds, lots of bony fish, and we're now currently 111 elasmobranchs, I think. And there's an R package, and it's documented on GitHub. So if you're interested in that, you can go and have a look at that. But what Nathan did very cleverly is he took this approach with the state space models that we worked on and applied it to a big set of abundance time series for 18 species of these oceanic sharks and rays listed on the, that's your right, isn't it? Listed on your right. No, that's your left, my right. And he bundled all these population trajectories together into a living planet index, which we just heard has problems, but anyway, and generated a kind of trajectory of decline for these 18 species using these 15-7 abundance time series from around the world. And what we were able to show is that these oceanic sharks have declined by 71% since 1970, so in 50 years. And using other data sets, seas around us and FAO fisheries landings, we were able to show that that's linked directly to an 18-fold increase in fishing pressure. And if we look at another kind of metric, so we track their red list status through time. So this is looking at how the status of these species has changed in terms of the IUCN red list. So 1980 here on your right, you can see that most of the species, if we apply retrospectively the red list to 1980, most of these species would have been considered least concern or near threatened, so they weren't in the threat categories. And as you move over to the other end of the graph, I'm giving up on size. in 2018, you can see that most of the species are now in threat status, and a good proportion are endangered, critically endangered. If you overlay that on, you kind of turn that into a red list index. This is what looks like for the oceanic sharks and rays, is the dark line. You can see that that's declined from around about 0.87, I think it is, 0.86, down to about 0.55 over the last 40 years. And as a group, these oceanic sharks and rays are amongst the most threatened of all vertebrate, or actually of all taxa. But that's just a specific group of sharks. So global sharks is up here somewhere. But they're really, these are the cycads, which are considered to be some of the most threatened species on the planet. And anyway, they're sitting kind of down around the cycads. And you can kind of think, if red list index of 1 is everything's fine, nothing to worry about, and 0 is extinct, these species have got themselves halfway to extinction, or we've got them halfway to extinction over the last 50 years. So that's that. But it's not all doom and gloom. Now, I'm not involved in this work, but some of you might have seen this come out last week or the week before, very timely. This is really some super bit of work that Nathan and Nick Dolby were involved in. And so they have taken the approach that Nathan developed in the Nature paper based on our JARA analysis and applied it to the other big oceanic predators that are out there. So, of course, sharks aren't the only big oceanic fish. There's the billfish and the tuna that these fisheries are usually targeting. And they've managed to develop a continuous red list index for some of the oceanic sharks, some of the billfish, and most of the tuna, I think. And if you look at them as a group, okay, it looks really bad, right? Really, really bad. But actually, they've managed to bend the curve. So they managed to get the trajectory going back up. And that increase actually ties in really nicely with proactive fisheries management measures that came in around about 2008. And those species have responded to that management intervention, which is really, really good. Except if you tease those apart and you look at the oceanic sharks, which we saw previously are not doing well, versus the billfish and tunas. where that fisheries management measure comes in, because it's directed at it's targeted at the directed catch of billfish and tuna, those start to increase and recover really rapidly, but sharks are still on this particularly problematic downward trend. They could only do this for 5 of the species, this continuous red list index. So that's really good news. Conservation and management can work for these oceanic species, but it shows quite how important it is that we introduce some fisheries management for oceanic sharks and rays rapidly. There are some reasons to be hopeful, so it's not all doom and gloom. As I said, we were able to do 111 red list assessments now for elasmobranchs in a whole project with the shark specialist group, where they have assessed all of the 1,200 approximately species of sharks and rays globally. And those robust assessments were really helpful for the shark specialist group and the Shark League, which is a group of NGOs, to go to CITES COP18 in Geneva in 2019 and COP19 this year in Panama City, and to present these robust assessments of declines and red list criteria. And again, if you've been following conservation news on social media, you might have seen that just last week, actually 97 species of elasmobranchs were just added to CITES Appendix 2 last week, which is a huge win for the NGOs and the specialist group that have been advocating for this. But 55 of those species use JARA to underpin their red list assessments, and those assessments and our nature paper were cited in the recommendation by the Panama government to list these species. And there's some hope that that will lead to really rapid changes from the regional fisheries management authorities, and some precedent for that. So this is shortfin mako, which was listed as endangered in 2019, shortly before the COP18 in Geneva. In Geneva. Listed as Appendix 2, just after we red list assessed it as endangered. And Nick Dolby, who was then the chair of the Species Survival Commission for Sharks, took that to the CITES and presented that work. And I'm told it was really important. Having that robust red list assessment was really important in its listing. The EU, which catches 74% of North Atlantic mako, shortfin mako in the North Atlantic, set its first catch limits for mako ever in 2021, so last year. It's great. And in the same year, depending on how this stands for International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, or International Conspiracy to Catch All Tunas, depending on how you're feeling, I guess, at the time. So ICAT, which is one of the regional fisheries management authorities, introduced its first landing ban for mako for 2 years, for this year and next year. And that's also in response to fishery stock assessments, which have again shown that these mako are in trouble. And then again, just last week, lots of things happening for sharks last week. ICAT introduced a quota for the South Atlantic, which will cut catches by 40 to 60%. So there is hope for sharks. And then lastly, I don't think Phil's not here. I think he's still away, but I wanted to just a nod to Phil's paper, because this also happened, I think, last week. This is some work that Phil Doherty and I've misspelled his surname, and Brendan and Lucia Mayer have worked on, and a bunch of folks from here with Fish Tech Marine, trialing these things which are called Shark Guard. They're a really neat device which sends a little electrical pulse out to deter sharks from grabbing hold of a hook. They tested it in a bluefin tuna fishery, which mainly has bycatch of blue sharks and pelagic rays, and they were able to show a 91% reduction in bycatch of blue sharks and 71% reduction of pelagic rays, and that's really super. I just wanted to flag that. It's a very short paper. You can go and read it in about 5 minutes. Right, now for the amazing segue from sharks to penguins. So how do we get from the sharks, oceanic sharks, which roam around, some of the most mobile predators in the world, to talking about penguins, which are African penguins, which are quite coastal, reasonably small, range restricted distribution. We're going to get there with the help of this beautiful animal, which is a lemon shark, and the help of Molly, who's at the back, who's doing her PhD with me on lemon sharks in the Bahamas. That's where Molly, well, I should say should get to go to do the field work. That's a bit of a sore point. This is where Molly would like to go and do her field work, this beautiful reef, Bimini in the Bahamas. Molly doesn't work on those amazing adult lemon sharks, which I should say, whilst not as widely roaming as the species of shark we were dealing with in the oceanic sharks, they do kind of move around the Atlantic and North Atlantic and South Atlantic, so they move quite widely when they're adults. But Molly works on them when they're a little bit smaller, between about 160 centimeters and 100 centimeters long. And what Molly's doing is trying to understand how they use this beautiful mangrove and reef habitat and sand and all these different things they have available in their habitat in the Bahamas. Molly is using a series of animals tagged with acoustic transmitters and a listening array. So this is a map of the listening array that that Molly uses the data from, set up by the Shark Lab in Bimini. And as I said, she's trying to understand how they make use of all these beautiful different bits of habitats that they have available to them. So deep water in blue, sand, mangroves, various types of seagrass and sargassum. And crucially, they also have this central refuge area here in the middle of the mangrove ecosystem, which Molly's marked with a green diamond in the diagram there. And that's really important because it's transmissible for the small sharks. They can move through it, but the larger sharks and the large teleosts that live in this system can't. So it's a refuge. And Molly's done loads of really fancy Bayesian movement models and habitat modeling, which I don't have time to really tell you all the details, and I don't understand. Anyway, but it turns out that the thing that the sharks really love is being close to the refuge. This is the thing that really predicts their habitat use, is just how close they are to that safety of the mangroves, which tells us that even these species which move around the oceans when they're some parts of their life cycle move very widely, can have these bits of the life cycle where they're in spatially restricted areas where we can maybe do something about protecting them in those smaller areas. Thanks, Molly. That was very helpful. So we still have to get to penguins. We know that lots of seabirds have this same setup where they will use certain areas for part of their life cycle. And we know that MPAs can work very well for seabirds, for some seabirds, in some situations. So this is work that Phil, a master's student some years ago, did with me on rock lobster, which is not a very mobile species, kind of tends to stay where it is. And these cormorants, which feed on rock lobster, and she showed quite convincingly that protecting the rock lobster stocks within 20 kilometers of the cormorants' foraging range would lead to increases in their population. So a fairly classic use of a marine protected area to protect a benthic organism. But we also know that big marine protected areas, when they're big, can also protect pelagic foragers. And so this is work from PhD student Pete Carr, and Alex, your photo is meant to be on there as well, but it's not made it onto the update in the slides. So this is work that Pete Carr and Alice Travail, who's at the back, have been doing in the Indian Ocean in Chagos, looking at red-footed boobies. And this figure just shows from a recent paper of Pete's that the marine protected area, the Chagos marine protected area, which is one of the biggest in the world, admittedly, really nicely protects the breeding distribution of red-footed boobies. Great. And so that's the context for the next question that I want to talk about, the next case study, which is small-scale marine protected areas for penguins. And I'm particularly interested in whether, as I said, we can use marine protected areas to protect pelagic species by protecting their prey and by protecting them from competition with fisheries. So this bit is a story about the African penguin, so the coastal penguin which breeds in southern Africa. And these are not actually sardine and anchovy, but pretend that these are sardine and anchovy that the penguins in South Africa feed on. Okay, you need a tiny little bit of context of penguins to understand this bit. So there used to be quite a lot of them in the 1930s, upwards of 300,000 pairs, it's thought, based on kind of hindcast modelling. By the 1970s, when the first censuses were done, they were already down to about 70,000 pairs due to a variety of threats: egg collecting, guano harvesting, introduced predators early on, industrial fisheries and oil spills from the 50s, and climate change from who knows when. By the time the first real good censuses were done, they were down in 79, they were down to about 65,000 pairs, sorry. And this plot really just kind of shows their continual population trajectory. A small recovery in the mid-2000s, which coincided with increases in sardine and anchovy. But then as sardine and anchovy were increasing, they shifted their spawning distribution about 300 kilometers to the east it turns out because of some climate change induced and probably fisheries induced changes as well. And so the penguins responded with a very dramatic decline from about 2003 onwards. And around about 2006, they got down to about 32,000 pairs. And the seabird bit of the South African government said to the fisheries bit of the South African government, please could we have some spatial fisheries restrictions to try to offset potential competition with the fishing industry. The fisheries bit said there is no competition with the fishing industry, so we'll see what happens in a minute. But by 2010, they were listed as endangered, and today, just to finish the population trajectory, they're down to about 15,000 pairs, so about 95% decline on what the sort was around in the 30s. So they're not doing that well. Okay, so rather than introduce any fixed closures at the time, the South African government decided they would do actually a very like a world-leading, very thoughtful fisheries closure experiment, but it's kind of turned into a bit of a mess. Anyway, lots of people have heard me talk about this before, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. But essentially, they set up these closed areas of about 20-kilometre radius around 2 pairs of islands, one on the west coast of South Africa and one on the south coast. These areas represent the core foraging range when the birds are feeding chicks, so they're the bit that in theory, we thought at that time really mattered to them. They're around about 1,000 square kilometres, some a bit smaller because of the land. And what we've been doing is working with the South African government to collect information on actual availability of fish in these areas with hydroacoustic surveys. We've been monitoring birds in the colonies, so looking at things like breeding success and chick condition, and we've been sticking fancy devices on them and looking at what happens when they go out to sea in various different ways. And the way the experiment worked was it was supposed to be kind of paired control design. So you have 3 years sort of closure at 2 of the islands in a pair, and then the next 3 years that would swap and the other 3 islands would be closed. So you have something that approximates a before-after control impact design. Okay, long story, very long story, you can ask me about that, but very long story short, we think we've demonstrated that, and crucially, when local prey abundance increases, so this is based on the hydroacoustic surveys, this is a real bit of rocket science, this. When you have less fish around the island, the penguins are skinnier than when you have more fish around the island and they're fat. We managed to demonstrate that. That was I should belittle it because that was my PhD student Kate's work, and it was really good, really important bit of work. We also because we also were able to demonstrate that when the fishery is not operating around the islands, we see an increase in chick condition. Initially, when we did the initial analysis, like a really big increase, 45%. We added some more data, it's dropped down to about 25%, but still, yeah, noisy, but we think an increase in chick condition when the closures are in place. And for the 2 islands in the Western Cape pair, which is the only island where we had productivity, we didn't have productivity data for the other pair, but for those 2 islands, a 10% increase in chick survival when the fishery was banned at both islands. It's approximately the same, and the effect size is almost the same size. And when you add that together and smoosh it, again, there's smooshing into a population model, that gives you a change in population growth rate of about 1%. So for context, that offsets about 20% of the current decline, if you believe my population models, which some people don't, but more about that in a minute. So some reasons to be hopeful. In 2019, a marine protected area was declared, and its stated purpose included for the conservation of the African penguin, the bank cormorant, Cape cormorant, and other threatened seabirds. It's quite a bit smaller than the closed areas and only partly closed to the fisheries, but progress nonetheless. The not everybody agrees bit is coming, so we've had a very long fight about how exactly is best to analyse these data. And not everybody agrees that these closures would be worth it. They don't think that it would be worth the potential cost to the industry, and they don't think it's worth the benefit to the penguins. I won't go into too much detail. There's an exchange in IC's Journal of Marine Science recently you can read if you want to, but essentially exactly what result you get depends on how you do the analysis, and there's disagreements about how you should do the analysis, and this figure is meant to be showing kind of these solid lines and coloured bars show the like meta-analysis type effect size of the different ways of analysing the data. And this dashed line is the 1% threshold. And the reason that's important is that was agreed early on as a threshold for management action and then somewhat rolled back on because it's argued that what's the point? So the argument basically goes, what's the point of only offsetting 20% of the decline? Do with that what you will. So, but there are genuine questions about whether these closed areas can actually benefit the population level can provide population level benefits without broader scale management, because as we saw with the lemon sharks, we know that these animals are moving around over wider spatial scales at other times of their life. So what we're doing now to try and get to the bottom of this, try and figure this out. So Jackie's doing a PhD. Jackie Glencross is a PhD student up at the University of St Andrews. She's taking a more in-depth look at some of the small-scale hydroacoustic survey data that's been collected. So she's actually trying to understand if the closures have impact on the fish. I should say that depth is maybe the wrong way around. It goes from 30 to 70. She plotted it the other way for me so that the graphs got deeper, and I said I don't like it. It doesn't work. Numbers have to go that way up the one axis. So deeper is higher up. Jackie's basically what this graph shows, that there's a different relationship between biomass and depth of schools when the fishery is operating than when it's not operating. Lots of noise. She's found this with a few metrics that the fish seem to behave differently when the closures are in place versus when fishing is allowed. And here she's got about a 10% difference at mean biomass between the depth of schools when the fishery is operating and when it's not operating. And really interestingly, she's also got, again, depth goes up. She's also got about a 10% difference in maximum dive depth of the penguins when the fisheries, so diving less deep when there's no fishing, having to dive deeper when there's fishing, at about 10% effect size, which matches really nicely to the 10% breeding success effect size. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. And then we're also really trying to understand how both how hard the fishing vessels and the penguins have to work to get to that fish and how the closures might impact upon that. So this is work that Stephen Lang, who's doing a postdoc with me, is doing, trying to understand how the fisheries behave when the closed areas are in place. This is using automatic identification system data and catch data from the South African government, and also trying to understand from videos and accelerometers, so some of the more fancy high-tech stuff we've put on the penguins in recent years, exactly how they go about, how hard they have to work to catch fish. And it's hard to see, but there are some fish being caught in that video. How hard they have to work to catch fish when the fishery is present and absent. So we're starting to look at energy expenditure, and Stephen's been doing some really cool stuff. We're also trying to understand whether that changes with the presence and absence of conspecifics. So Stephen's been working on a model to do some of that automatically, so automatically detect penguins in the video. And then hopefully if I press this button, that other one plays. There we go. And he's trying to automate that prey detection foraging event activity with computer scientist Thilo Burkhardt at the University of Bristol. But I should confess that was mocked up in PowerPoint. That's not really the model working. So more to be continued on that front. And yeah, and lastly, just to say on the penguin situation, so as I said, these animals move much more widely, and we're now trying to understand, and with some collaborators at BirdLife South Africa, who are tracking mature adults, and Jenny Grieg, who's doing a PhD with me, tracking immature adults. We're trying to understand how these animals use the environment during those non-breeding periods. It's very hard to see, but the closed area is there. So these immatures are going all over the place, and we now need to try and understand fisheries competition at that kind of spatial scale and those sorts of impacts. So we're trying to get to the bottom of that, of really what those closures mean. I don't have a fancy segue for this bit, so that's a terrible joke. Apologies. The last thing I wanted to talk about is seabird discards and bycatch. As I said, this is the kind of the third big impact. So you've got bycatch, which we sort of saw with the sharks, and directed overfishing, competition with the penguins, and this is sort of the big third way in which fisheries is impacting biodiversity, is through discards and bycatch. This is a bit of a twee example, I think, but this explains what discards are. It's unwanted catch being thrown overboard, and you can see clearly that in this picture that discards attract seabirds. So we don't really have a good sense of the global footprint or how much discards are thrown away, but there's a couple of recent papers, sorry, I should put that one up, a couple of recent papers that suggest that it's around about 10 million tons of fish thrown away annually, and that's about 10% of global catches. And it has a global footprint, so there's discarding going on in kind of all of the major fishing areas. And up here where we are in the North Atlantic, which is the green box, it's one of the largest areas for discarding the fisheries in the world. And we know from some meta-analyses, lit review type approaches, that perhaps around about half of all seabird species make use of discards at some part in their life cycle. So it's kind of a reasonably big source of food for them. And we know that the presence of discards can alter foraging behaviour, alter life history traits. I don't have time to go into all the details of that, but it seems likely that as fisheries change and discarding practices change, there's likely to be some substantial impacts for seabirds. And so there's some work we did recently looked at this for the North Sea, and it kind of picks up this idea of differential species responses, winners and losers. So thanks to some great work done in the 80s and 90s in the North Sea, we know something about how seabirds respond to fish being thrown overboard, how much of it gets eaten, which kinds of things get eaten. And Stefan Garth was able to use that information to estimate in the 1990s that about 6 million seabirds were supported by discards in the North Sea alone. We wanted to pick that up because discarding has changed. The discarding practices in the North Sea have changed quite substantially between when Stefan did the study, which was around the peak of discarding, and well, this only goes to 2010, but kind of today. So we teamed up with Stefan and oh yeah, I should say so that, and we know that discarding has declined by about half, roughly, from some good work by Heath and Cook on these hindcasts. And so we wanted to team up with Stefan, and this is work that Hannah Ladd-Jones did as her MSc project, and is led by Steve Vautier, who some of you will remember used to be in this building. And we were able to show by using these discards and some conversion factors for things that in Stefan's paper that these discards have decreased from about 510,000 tonnes to about 268,000 tonnes, so about 50% drop in discards over that, what is that, 30 years? Yeah. And by modelling that through into kind of the energetic requirements of seabirds, luckily we were able to reproduce Stefan's original estimate, which is good. So Stefan's original estimate was the black line here, around about 6 million tonnes. And we estimated for the 1990s about 5.6 million 6 million seabirds, sorry, 5.6 million seabirds. But we incorporated all the uncertainty, and you can see really enormous confidence intervals on that estimate. And by, again, following that process through, we were able to show that the number of seabirds that are able to be supported by discards now in the North Sea has dropped to around about 3.4 million, which is the red line and polygon. So big declines in the food available to seabirds in this region. And as you may have guessed, some from the title, some species benefiting from that change and some species not benefiting from that change and suffering. So things like northern fulmars showing substantial numbers of declines in the number of birds that could be supported by this food. So having to use other food resources. Same for black-legged kittiwakes, but some species like lesser black-backed gulls and common gulls doing well as a result of the changes in discard practices and the types of discards that are available. So this doesn't even take into account the landing obligation, which bans discarding in the EU, because that came in after the data set we had, but maybe will give us some indication about which species we should be worried about in terms of seabirds as discards practices change in the future. Okay, and just for the last few minutes sorry, there probably should be a trigger warning with that picture. The last few minutes, just want to talk about the other side of discards. So discards attracts birds to vessels, and the big problem with that, aside from the fact that discards changes the ecology and behaviour of birds, is that it can lead to incidental mortality in bycatch. Again, we don't have a great idea of how many birds are caught every year, but there are some estimates. Again, we know there's bycatch is a global footprint. This is some work from Dimas Giannuka, who did his PhD here with Steve when Steve was still here. So some of you remember Dimas. And yeah, just showing this global footprint of bycatch. And a recent paper led by BirdLife South Africa suggesting that bycatch is probably the biggest single threat to seabirds globally. So about 22% of all seabirds they felt were at risk of bycatch. And for comparison, that's overfishing at 14%. That's climate change, 21%. And they think that probably around about 1 million seabirds are bycaught annually today, and that's despite some mitigation measures, which I'll tell you about. There has been lots of work to mitigate bycatch over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly a lot of it led by Albatross Task Force and people working with the Albatross Task Force, lots of it focused on albatross species. Been some really successful things. So Tory lines, which are shown in this, the lines hanging down here from the warp cables of this trawler. They've been instigated and introduced in a lot of fisheries, have been really successful, reduced mortality by about 90% or over 90% in some fisheries. This thing, hook pod, which is a little bit analogous to the shark shield we saw earlier, has been shown to reduce mortality in longline fisheries by 95%. This thing's really cool. Basically, the hook goes into a little plastic cup, so you bait the hook. Well, fishermen, they don't like fisher and fisher person apparently. Fisherman baits the hook. You push the end of the hook into the plastic capsule. That goes down on the line, and the plastic capsule has a device in it that releases the hook once it gets down to depth beyond which the birds can dive. So that's really useful. And things like combinations of line weighting, Tory lines, and setting at night have reduced bycatch to 0 in some fisheries. And I should say I wasn't involved in any of this amazing work. But despite all of those really good initiatives, there's still hundreds of thousands of birds being killed in fisheries every year. And trawl fisheries are still a particular problem because they generate lots and lots of waste. And crucially, because of all that waste, because of the provision of food, the birds are attracted to the vessels. So what you're seeing on the side here is the difference between a trawler in the South Atlantic that's not discarding in the top and a trawler that is continuously discarding. And all of those birds are black-browed albatross pretty much in that image. I don't have high-resolution photos, sorry, so they have to be small. But some work I've been involved in, again, led by Steve Vautier, and working with the South Atlantic Environment Research Institute, and the work, most of the work being done by Amanda Kupfer, who's doing her PhD with myself and Steve. Amanda's been trying to understand if batch discarding, so retaining the fisheries waste on board and discarding it in boluses, essentially, can help to reduce some of the potential impact of this discarding. So Amanda's done about 200 hours of observations on 2 trawlers at sea of about 100 trawls in 3 different categories of discard. So continuous discarding when the vessel's not discarding, and when they've been retaining the stuff and discarding it in boluses, in batches. And all of, if we add on, so if you remember, the top picture was the trawler not discarding, nothing to see here, essentially. If you add on the bolus discarding, this is what it looks like. Now, you might be struggling to see where the birds are. They're all back there in a massive clump, well away from the trawl gear, because the food gets dumped in a batch and sinks, and the birds kind of stay with it instead of following the vessel. And all of Amanda's hundreds of hours of surveys have been distilled into this nice graph, which shows that a huge reduction in the abundance of black-browed albatross, in this case within the area of the gear where they're likely to interact with the gear and get bycaught, when you have batch discarding versus continuous discarding, and about a 50% decline in heavy contacts. So these are where the birds hit the warp cables in a heavy way, which is the thing that's most likely to lead to mortality in these fisheries. And so just by retaining the food on and dumping it in boluses, you can substantially reduce the probability of those birds being bycaught. And they're starting now to look to introduce that actually in some of the fisheries in the Falklands. More or less made it. I really wish I had some amazing take-home messages, and I was trying to think of some when I wrote the slides, and it's kind of like a brain dump and whistle-stop tour through all the stuff we've been doing in the last few years. These are the best things I could come up with. I think there are going to be winners and losers from the Anthropocene. That's not really news. There are lots of reasons for ocean optimism and for hope, so there's lots of great stuff going on to bend those curves of biodiversity, but we do really need to understand our species and our ecology, and we need species-specific level interventions. So those big global analyses I started with are all well and good, but it needs lots of people working, I shouldn't say on the ground, on the ocean, on the water, to understand the ecology to really solve the problem. That's me. Thank you very much for looking.
Great, thanks, Rich. That was brilliant. Packed full of stuff and
I'm tired.
on time. Who's got anything they want to ask or comment on?
I forgot to use the clicker.
Yeah.
Basically, cool. I just wondered with your Mako shark example that there's optimism that wants to catch less. Is that because of those innovations you mentioned, or I assume they're all bycatch, or?
Mako's targeted, so Mako's one of the few, well, it's mixture. The catch is a bycatch in the tuna fisheries, but there's also some targeted catch for it because it's very valuable. So it's one of the few oceanic sharks that's really, really valuable. And
Is it sold in, is it eaten in?
yeah, it's eaten in I think Spain and Portugal predominantly in the EU, but it's eaten in quite a few. So the flesh is eaten in quite a few countries, and fins obviously still used as well because the sharks are landed whole, so they can use the fins. It's a really tricky one. It's really interesting that the RFMOs have been really resistant to reduce the catches on it because it's really valuable. But some work that Henning, my mate of Jara fame, no, he's famous for other things. But anyway, Henning's done some of the stock assessments, particularly for the South Atlantic, and that work suggests that there's kind of demographic time bomb going on with that stock, because the only reason there's still even vaguely any mako out there is because the females get so big that the fishery can't land them because they break the lines. They're essentially like pelagic white sharks. They're huge. And because those few big animals are still out there reproducing, that's the only reason the stock hasn't completely collapsed. But they think that even without fisheries, there's only about a 60% chance they can recover. Even if they close all fisheries now, well, 2 years ago, there's about a 60% chance they'll recover that stock. So I was using it as optimism, but actually, yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that really answered the.
No, I was just kind of interested in.
Yeah. It's a really interesting fishery.
Yeah, similar on those lines. So earlier, I think you showed the graph with the things like sailfish and tuna fisheries and the sharks, and the intervention that helped the desirable fish, but the sharks carry on going down. I thought about it a bit, but I don't know where to begin. Do you know what kind of reasoning for that? Is it because they're being killed anyway as bycatch, or is it just that they're like different fisheries and they're not really get up?
Yeah, yes. So in this case, this is because predominantly those are caught as bycatch in the tuna and billfish fisheries, and the management interventions that came in were your classic single stock fisheries assessment stuff around like, bluefin's in trouble, we need to catch less of it. So they put in quotas and management to reduce the catch of bluefin tuna. But most of the fisheries were caught, the sharks were caught incidentally, either died on the lines because no care was taken to release them, or they were retained. So things like blue shark and mako or beagle have been retained for quite a long time. Some of the threshers and hammerheads just die quite easily if the fishermen aren't careful with them, and there was basically just no management around it. So
tuna itself, catch them and put them back.
I don't think it's catching really. I think it's just it's quotas essentially on what they're allowed to catch. It's just changes in fisheries management. So they just introduced stricter catches, and I think closed areas and time area closures in fishery.
Because it could almost suggest so maybe the less switching to other forms of fishing that still catch sharks the bycatch.
Yeah.
Well, I just cut one out.
There is some suggestion that potentially targeting of mako in particular has gone up as a replacement, which again is one of the reasons why the NGOs are so keen that some management implementation come in very quickly for mako.
You would expect like sharks to have slower recoveries than like tuna and bluefin because their demographic rates are so low.
Yeah.
Is that what they think? Like,
yeah,
any sort of population rebound would take longer to come up in fisheries.
Yeah. So that's what I kind of didn't really finish my thought about the mako, but that's what I meant by the demographic time bomb. They think that actually they've been fishing out that middle recruitment kind of middle-aged sharks so hard that there's a gap in the demography, and it's going to take a long time for the animals that the pups that are being born from the females that are still out there to get back into the system. So yeah, you'd expect much slower recovery.
Yeah.
I'm interested in all the cool devices and stuff that you can put on the lines to deter various things. Who makes the decisions about, purchasing those and putting them on? Like, how effective are they? How widespread can they be? Are they something that could take off in a big way? Are they going to be real barriers to getting those
Yeah, I don't know that much about hook pod, I have to say. I know that it's been mandated in a handful of fisheries. But I think generally those are decisions made by the individual fleets, and the individual like companies that operate. But with seabird bycatch, they don't want to catch seabirds. Like it's a waste. So obviously they don't want to be seen to be catching seabirds because that's bad, but also it's wasted bait. So I think there's been things like Tory lines and like night setting and stuff and waiting lines, really good take up on those things. I don't know about hook pod because they're expensive. And I think that's the same situation for the shark guard. Is they've just done this one test and it's like basically we need to operationalize this, but there's a long way to go to do that, to get fisheries to take it up, because it will be relatively expensive, I guess. And they had a decrease in capture of bluefin tuna, although that wasn't significant in that study. So they still need to figure out if that was kind of just a fluke, that particular study, and do a bit more replication. Obviously, the fishermen aren't going to make the decreases that bluefin catch.
More questions?
So, Rich, I was interested in Molly's work, and
She's at the back
trying
channel
to
for us.
Molly. So, the best predictor of where Atlantic shark are going to be is littoral habitats.
Well, they're not sort of strictly not pelagic at that point, right? I mean, they have this bit of the life cycle where they're really reef associated. And that in that bit of the life cycle, they just seem to be very, they seem to be very aware of the fact that their environment is full of very big toothy things, which would eat them.
Yeah. And so, Molly, was there any difference between those littoral habitats, mangrove, seagrass?
Yeah, I'm trying to tease the secondary importance of carp right now, but the primary driver was the eastern central refuge, so it's a 3-year age size. But it looks like medium density seagrass might be the next most important, just from like preliminary stuff like that. But if you, in that habitat, there's actually, Rich and I were talking about this last week, and if you want to say, protect this, if we're thinking about trying to make a protected area or a recommendation for it actually feasible, instead of having it be that entire dark purple area, if it turns out that medium density seagrass, which is that kind of medium shaded blue, if it turns out that is second in importance in terms of habitat use, then these guys might be able to shrink that recommended and definitely get it down. So yeah, it looks like that medium density seagrass is pretty important, which I'm doing the prey species habitat selection next, and I think just anecdotally that's probably also an important area for them. So it would be a good outcome.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said how important seagrass was.
Well, I mean, but no, I think there is a trade-off, isn't there, between density of seagrass and avoidance of predation and like ability.
Yeah, the other thing is, in the medium density seagrass, the areas right outside the mangroves are actually pretty silty. So your visibility is pretty low in that immediate area. So it'll be interesting to see if it's still. I think they're using that refuge area for protection, but also they're very social at that age. So they have known associations with other individuals that they keep over time. And so I think that there's a group level effect from that here of the importance of this habitat, not only from a resource, but from a risk level and social importance.
So does this area have any form of protection on it?
This was the shark sanctuary
It is.
sometime in the 2000s, but that means nothing. That's more of a vocabulary thing. The biggest threat to these guys in this area isn't overfishing, but coastal habitat loss. So if you look on the kind of the northwestern quadrant of that middle figure, you see that gray area. That's urban development. That Rich. That was all mangrove until 2005. So the population took a big demographic hit at that time point. And so the central bit of mangrove is the only bit that has a relatively viable population left. Because there was a subpopulation that was very dependent on that western border of mangrove. So the threat here is habitat loss of that central mangrove bit where certain people want to build a golf course in years.
Don't pick holes in my segue though.
When are you going out there next morning?
Well, that's a terrible question.
Yeah, but there's a big permit situation, so it's kind of impossible to do any research work. But a collaborator and I are planning on writing a treaty to go back and just kind of like reconnect with the habitat and the sharks and stuff. So maybe sometime in the spring.
So the lab that Molly's working with, the shark lab, has been there for 30 years and they've been unable to get research permits for the last 2 years, 3 years? 2 years? Yeah. No, it's a change. It's kind of a change so the government Bahamas set up a new permitting system, and they did that during COVID. So part of it was like teething problems and delays and stuff. But it also seems to be, well, I don't know. It seems to be a response to, quite rightly, to avoiding the worst bits of parachute science. But it seems to have kind of gone, because you get a lot of US labs working there because of the proximity to the southeast of the US, and I think they've trying to avoid some of that worst elements of parachute science, but in the meantime, they seem to have also shot everybody in the foot.
The other big issue there is biodiversity. In 2013, a pharmaceutical company based in the US paid $70 million for a permit to extract some endemic sponge DNA, and then they proceeded to make $4 billion off that in the following fiscal year. And all the Bahamas saw was a $70 permit. So there's a lot of that went into this sort of social push from local Bahamians to make it so that Americans couldn't come in and make billions off of what is Bahamian, which is really good. Like Rich said, there's also been a lot of issues with colonial science in this area historically, but they really shot themselves in the foot because, like, for the research station I worked at, they've been for the past 10 years really working on encouraging local scientists. And starting in the same year I was, they were supposed to have 2 PhD students based at Nassau in the Bahamas. So local Bahamians trying to like help them get PhDs, and they had to cancel their projects and their degrees because they hadn't been able to get a permit in their own country. So it's been pretty devastating across the board.
Molly, because she didn't get to go to the bar.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well,
Yeah, of course, exactly.
Yeah,
More seagrass. I don't know, maybe not.
I got to learn all the Bayesian things that melt my brain.
well, we're out of time, I think. It's been a brilliant talk though, so thank you very much. It's great to know what you're doing and see all of you here as well. So thanks for coming. We're going to have a recording of it on the website so that anyone who's missed it can catch up later on. A big thanks. Thank you. Back to service in January, and Tom there is going to do our talking end of January, so you'll get news about that. Thanks. Great.